Maya with Youth Voices, and today I am joined by a very special and important guest. We have Kentucky State Representative Senator McGarvey, and we're here to talk about the challenges of partisanship, issues of justice, and the importance of voting. So, Senator McGarvey, would you please introduce yourself by telling us about your position and what brought you into this life of public service?
Sure, and thanks for having me on, Maya. My name is Morgan McGarvey. I live here in Louisville. For anybody listening, I grew up here. I went to Manual High School. I was not actually all that interested in politics or in government at a young age. I mean, I watched it and paid attention to it, but wasn't interested at this level. And so went off to college, got a journalism degree there, worked at a local television station, and started covering politics in mid-Missouri. So Jefferson City is the capital of Missouri. It's a lot like Frankfort in Kentucky, and it's kind of a small town in the middle of the state where the most stuff going on there is state government. Got to watch a lot of really cool things and sort of got interested in that and being in government, being in campaigns and working for change that way. So that kind of, sparked my interest and worked on some campaigns, went and worked on the Hill, and then ultimately decided I probably needed another degree. So I went to law school, graduated from UK Law School, and went to work in private practice, did a brief stint in the Attorney General's office before kind of coming back, and then all of a sudden got a chance to run in my early 30s and got elected in 2012 and kind of haven't looked back. So it's been a lot of fun. I represent Louisville, or a big portion of Louisville, in the state Senate. And for the last 2 years, I've been the Democratic leader of the state Senate. So I oversee a lot of our caucus's strategic initiatives, our staff, and handle those sorts of aspects of the job as well. In Frankfurt, we call it the president of the Senate. We actually have a president of the Senate instead of a leader. In Washington, they call it the leader. But because we're in the minority, all that means is, one of the things we do is we try to give a differing view. We work with the majority when we can, but we also stand up for our policy initiatives that are important to us. We just don't get the opportunity to bring them to the floor without the consent of the majority.
Yes, and I'm sure that's very difficult. And hopefully we'll get to touch on some of those issues later. But you've been in this leadership position for a while. So my first question to you is, well, when I think of good leadership, I think of this obligation as a public servant to advance ethical, cooperative, and pragmatic solutions. So from your experience, what do you think are the qualities of good leadership, and when do we know that good leadership has expired?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do as a leader is listen. And oftentimes, especially I think for people younger, and I know you guys think I'm old, but in Frankfurt, I'm not old. I'm just old on this Zoom. But you got to learn to listen. And I think a lot of times you want to show that you know something. And so you want to interject and put your opinion up. But leaders have to listen. And especially if in a legislative body, you've got to listen to what your members are telling you, because your urban members are different than your rural members, and your Democrats are different from your Republicans. You've got to listen to those points of view and try to understand what people are thinking, how you can bring people together, what's the best way forward. So I think listening is really important. When you do speak, and it's important that you know what you're talking about. So you have to do the work to learn about a subject, to kind of be somewhat of an expert in it. So you got to listen. Then when you speak, you got to know what you're talking about. And I'll tell you one thing, and this is just a big deal. I know it sounds simple, but always try to treat your word as your bond. And when you're in, especially something like whether it's business or law, or you're dealing with other people as part of your job, when you tell them something, you want to be as right as you possibly can, and you want to believe in what you're saying, so that when other people know that when you tell them something, you really believe it to be the truth. I think that's a really important quality for a leader to have.
Mm-hmm. And definitely, that kind of quality of having like integrity, and then also being able to be truthful in your word. I think that's something that most people would want to see in our representatives. And that's also something that we should uphold just, as being a good human. So I completely am with you on that. And of course, it would be more important at state level. So the next thing I kind of want to touch on are some of these issues of justice, because obviously it has been a very tumultuous time. So in this time of like bitter partisanship and social unrest, I kind of feel like a new narrative of justice has emerged, and recent civil discourse has allowed Americans to be increasingly vigilant about the importance of maintaining a balance between freedom and order. And as Americans continue to demand justice, like the imperative to advance cooperative solutions at state level has become increasingly important, or at least that's how I see it. So my question for you is, what are some of the challenges you see, first in our community, but second in state Congress, that keep us from addressing some of these solutions related to justice issues we're seeing?
That's a long question. So I'm going to take my best stab at it. First of all, I think it's great that we're talking about issues of justice and issues of equity, right? That, it's what Joe Biden said in the debate this past week, that you can have law, order, but you need justice. We're noticing, and it's been this way for a long time, and even in Louisville, we've noticed sort of this segregated aspects of this city. But that, our Black community and people of color are being treated differently under the law, and that's wrong. And we have to end that. And part of that comes through something that makes people uncomfortable, but it's important to talk about these things that make people uncomfortable. And part of this is coming from what we're seeing as systemic racism. And we need to be aware of these biases, and we need to do our best to root them out, to give everybody an equal and fair chance at the American dream. And that's sort of what I think when we're talking about justice. It's that basic fairness. It's that people are treated the same way. And so we're looking at that, and we're looking not just at how our laws reflect that, but how our laws are carried out and whether there's a disparate impact in that. And we're focusing on criminal justice, which is great. That's a great place to start. And I'm not just being like a politician and saying it's a great place to start. I think criminal justice is a really good place to start because we start from the same spot. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you want to live in a safe community. You want your community to be safe and for people not to be afraid to go out of their homes. So if you start from the same spot in what you want, then you can oftentimes find a way to work together. And so I think we need to look at things like bail reform. Why do we have bail? Because we typically have bail because either someone's so dangerous they can't be on the street, or because we want to make sure they show back up in court. Well, if somebody's not a danger at all, and there's no risk of them fleeing, then your economic status should never determine your access to justice. And there are people right now who are locked up in prison, or I should say jail, not really prison, but they're locked up in jail just because they couldn't meet their bail. They're not a danger to their community, and they're not a risk of flight, but they're going to lose their job. They're going to disrupt their family, and the state also bears the cost of having them in jail. So, criminal justice reform, bail reform, ending no-knock warrants, requiring body cameras, ending chokeholds, having civilian review boards that have subpoena power. These are all things that have come to light and are really being discussed, especially because of the Breonna Taylor situation in Louisville. That's an awesome thing. People, have made their voices heard. Those voices have been heard, and I expect good policy changes in Frankfurt. But we need to go deeper. We need to make sure that everyone has access to quality healthcare. I mean, still in the year 2020, your zip code shouldn't determine your life expectancy. And we're seeing that play out across Louisville. We need to make that better. We need to look at education, and there are initiatives on the ballot this year for JCPS. We know that there is not equity even in public education, and how do we get the resources to the places we need them? When we do pass a law, we have a fiscal impact statement on a bill. So if we pass a law, we get an idea of how much money it's going to cost or how much money it's going to generate for the state. Why wouldn't we have a racial impact statement so that we can actually look and say, how will this bill further impact communities of color? And what is there a disparate impact that could result from this bill? So I think those types of just causes are what we should be discussing. I mean, we have a long way to go. And part of that is understanding and looking at ourselves, understanding privilege and understanding history and understanding what we need to do to repair that. But we've got to go forward in a way where we are creating that just and equitable community for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of touches on what you said earlier. I mean, one of the most important things in leadership is just being able to listen to those communities and listen to others and continue to educate others, because like we have to really be unified in order to advance things such as like racial, educational, and environmental justice, and criminal justice reform, which are all becoming so important, and they have been important, but in light of like the pandemic and then of course everything that's occurring in Louisville. So my next question for you is like, even when politics are so polarizing and divisive, like personally, I have to believe that we're more alike than different. So, what do you think are some community maxims or things that all people can agree on that will allow us to be empathetic, um, so that we can maximize these values basically to bring solidarity?
If I truly had the answer to that question, we would have solved a big problem. But I think, so I'll start small, right? There's a great example just on Friday night of a football team from Jackson, Kentucky, in Breathitt County, which is right there at the opening to Appalachia in southeast Kentucky. And they drove up 100 and something miles to play Shawnee High School here in Louisville in football because Shawnee was having trouble finding an opponent. And this is a struggling rural Appalachian community that came up to a struggling community in Louisville. And if you watch the pregame speech from that coach, the boys playing football that night had a lot more in common than they probably thought. And it's important for us to realize some of those similarities. And so to, sports in that instance, it's a small thing, right? It's a football game. It's just a football game. But it was a small gesture that caught national attention for trying to bring people together. So I think we always need to look for ways to bring people together, whether it is a policy like we talk about in criminal justice reform or an education initiative, whether it's something as simple as sports or even, occasionally hosting the high school basketball tournament in Louisville to get people to our city to show that Louisville's not that different from the rest of the state in so many ways. I think we have to get together. But it goes back to what I said. It goes back to listening. It goes back to being able to sit down together. And I mean, I told you I'm not old, but I do remember a time when we used to disagree on how to solve problems, but we agreed on what the problems were. And I think we need to get back to that. I think we need to get back to a time when we agree on what the problems are, because we do have problems. And we're talking on Zoom right now as opposed to in person because of COVID-19, because of something we didn't even know about when 2020 started. But we had one segment of the political spectrum basically try to say for a long period of time that COVID-19 was a hoax. We couldn't even agree that we were in the middle of a global pandemic. Well, if you can't agree that you have a problem, how can you solve it? So we've got to get to that point where we're not trying to score political points by saying we do or don't have a problem. We have a problem. Let's put forward the ideas to fix it. And I think once you agree on the problem, then it's a lot easier to listen to the ideas about the solution.
Yes, and one like very important thing that people can do to make sure that we are coming together on problems is ultimately voting and making sure that we're getting more people to vote. And this kind of brings us into the final thing that I'd like to talk to you about today is the importance of voting, especially during the pandemic. And today's actually a very special day because in Kentucky, it is the last day to register to vote. Um, so during the pandemic, many eligible voters are concerned about contracting or spreading COVID. And I have seen this because I call voters on weekends, and a lot of them have expressed this fear. But actually, voting has never been more accessible and equitable in Kentucky, because all people can vote by absentee ballot early in their county clerk's office and in their precinct on November 3rd. So, my question for you is, do you think we can use this to expand the Kentucky electorate and increase civic engagement?
Yes, absolutely. And we should. We should expand our voting laws in Kentucky. And we saw how well it worked in the primary when you were allowed to vote by mail or go in early. And I'll give you a technical term. This is what we call no excuse voting. It used to be to go in and vote in person early before an election. You had to have a reason. I've done it before. I'll give you an example. I think I did it in the 2018 election because I was coming back from a trip that Tuesday and I didn't know if I would make it back in time to vote, especially if there'd been any slight delay in my flight. So I voted early. But you have to go and they question. You had to give the reasons. I had to tell them where I was going to be and why I was going to be there and when I thought I'd be back. And so now for 3 weeks before the election, including Saturdays, which is a big deal, you can just go in and vote at one of these polling locations. You don't have to have a reason. It's just it doesn't work to vote on one day, right? So you can go and vote early. You can vote by mail. Even the Republican Secretary of State said there was no instance of voter fraud when we voted by mail in the primaries. Why not make it easy for people? You were able to vote by mail anyway if you requested an absentee ballot. Why do you have to have a reason to request your ballot by mail? Why can't you just vote if that's easier? I mean, we vote on the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November, but no one talks about why. Why do we vote on that day? Well, it goes back to when we were in an agrarian calendar. So you wanted to do it after the harvest. And then they didn't want to do it right after everybody closed their books for the month, which is why you don't do it ever on the first Tuesday in November, which would be November 1st, because you might have just closed your books. They at least give you a day or two to figure that out. But that's why we vote. And in Kentucky, it's been an incredibly restrictive 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And think about that. If you've got kids, if you're a single parent, if you work a certain shift, we shouldn't make it that difficult to exercise your voice in your government. And so I'm thrilled with these changes. I hope this is something from COVID that continues. And I hope we even take it further. Kentucky is one of 2 states in the country that has incredibly restrictive and prohibitive laws on people who've been convicted of a felony about getting their rights back. We should have restoration of voting rights for people who have served their complete sentence. We should have voting by mail. We should have early voting, no excuse voting. And you should be able to vote on election day if that's your preference. But the point is, everyone should vote. We should make it easy to vote. And when you do vote, I know it doesn't feel this way, but your vote matters. I'll give you 2 examples. I mean, in 2018, there are 2 people right now serving in the House of Representatives in Kentucky. One of them won by 1 vote, and one of them won by 7 votes. The guy who won by 7 votes, he won by 14 votes. That's the story. His name's Cluster Howard. And Cluster won by 7 votes the first time and 14 votes the second time. We call him landslide, right? I mean, he squeaked his way through. So your voice really does matter. And when you look at even races that are won and lost by a couple of hundred votes, or even in the statewide election in 2019 between Governor Bevin and now Governor Beshear, it was 5,100 and something votes, 5,100 roughish votes decided that election out of over 1 million cast. That's an incredibly small number. And every vote mattered in that election, and it showed. So I think having more people participate is an awesome thing. And for Maya, you and your friends to not get discouraged, to take voting seriously, to look up information on the candidates, get out there, decide who you think is going to be best. Because, at the end of the day, I said, I'm still young, so I'm going to be hopefully living a lot longer under whatever laws we pass today. But it's you and the next generation that's really going to inherit the laws that are passed today. And I think you guys deserve a say in that.
And I think one positive consequence, I guess you could say, of the pandemic, like you said, is we've created this new Kentucky infrastructure to make voting more equitable and accessible. So what I hope to see is increased youth turnout, kind of like what you're saying, so that we can continue to advance these solutions to some of the issues that we've touched on today. I think it's a really special time, honestly, to vote, because I'm hoping that more people will put their voice out into their communities, because ultimately that's what voting allows us to do. And I'm looking forward to November 3rd because of that. So you also said, though, that some people don't think that their voices matter. And we see this because, again, not everybody comes out to vote. I don't know what the percentages are exactly, but it's definitely lower than what it should be. So why do you think some people are apathetic or indifferent to politics, and how can that be dangerous?
Yeah, I think it's hard sometimes to get involved, right? It's hard to figure things out. It's, you got to really look for coverage. So much of the coverage is biased. Then you just start to think, does it really matter? It's just me. I'm just one person. No, every vote matters, because you guys also impact the way we run campaigns, right? Campaigns are run by targeting people who are likely to vote, because you only have so many resources in a campaign. So you target the people who are most likely to vote. So the campaign ads that you see on TV, those are geared toward people who we think are likely to vote. And so by becoming a person who's likely to vote, by getting involved in the process, you start to change the way the whole thing works. And I think that's a really important point just by going and voting. Looking something up on somebody, Google somebody, figure out a few things. We have a two-party system. And a lot of people don't love that, but it gives you an idea oftentimes of where people stand on certain issues. So whatever it is you care about, whether it's the environment, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's workers' rights and wages, whether it's taxes, business rights, whatever it is, find the people that kind of match up with how you feel and go vote. Because again, it's your government. I tell people this all the time. You know who my boss is? You. If you live in my district, you're my boss, and you decide every 4 years whether I get to keep my job. And so, that's why I try to communicate with as many people as possible and respond to questions and get online and communicate with people, because it's important. But you have that power. Everyone has that power. Every person who votes gives me a job review. I just hope that more people think I'm doing a good job than a bad job, but it's,
Yes.
you know, it's so important for people to go vote and to know who their representatives are, to know who represents them in both the state and federal government, because then they get a say in what they do. And by having a say, it does impact, I think, the discourse of government.
And I definitely think that, like, just from, I mean, the past few years, democracy works best ultimately, when we have more people, investing in their communities by voting, because then again, there are more people being represented, and we can, like you said, like, you can cater to their needs by representing them. So we really do thank you for your life in public service. And thank you so much for joining us today. I promise that this won't take longer than 25 minutes, so I'll let you go. But it is so important, I think, to see our community leaders and representatives listening to our communities. And by doing this today, I feel like you've made a space for that. So thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.